Okay, we're back, and I just wanted to discuss a little bit about creating your imagery and how you get your image from your drawing onto your block. And there's a couple different methods that you can use. Now, I'm going to be printing today on multiple blocks, but I also want to discuss reductive woodcuts. Sometimes they call them, or reductive lino cut, could also be called a suicide print or a suicide block. The first thing that I always want students to do is, come up with a drawing. And you can do that drawing in graphite. You should work on scale, so the same scale that you're going to be working on your block. And once you have that design, you're going to want to, just tidy it up a little bit, because this process is very linear. All of your marks you're making cuts, right? And so you're not shading, you're not using like a lot of stippling or anything like that. Everything that you're doing is different types of linear cuts. You can do types of stippling, but it's a little bit different. So you have to kind of be aware of that process. That's what the relief printing does well. Whereas other processes, intaglio, does tones well with aquatints and lines well with etching. Lithography does things differently and does things that other processes don't do. Same with serigraphy. That's why we have so many various processes, because they all have something that they do well, and not necessarily things that don't necessarily work well as well. So never try to force the imagery to be a certain style. You kind of have to adapt your style based on the materials that you're using and the techniques that you're using. So keep that in mind. With this one, okay, let's talk about reductive cuts first, because that's what my students are working on. And so basically I gave them two blocks, and I said, okay, you can do a reductive cut, or you can do a multi-block, or you can do both. You can do a multi-block and reductive cut together. And you can get many, many layers just from having one surface with a reductive cut. So this is what I'm intending on doing with this one. I might also go in and do another block with this in combination. I don't do a ton of relief printing, so I don't have a lot of great examples. But just to explain this, okay, this was a reductive woodcut, and this is the print that resulted from it. So you can see it looks pretty messy. It's been through the print, the press, like 30-40 times. And you can see the only thing that's left on this is my black, because the black is the last thing that you're going to print. Essentially what you're going to do is come up with a design and figure out what colors you want to use, how many layers you think you're going to need. Okay, so this was all just black and white. I did just grayscale. I think I did 3 layers, one with a light gray, one with a dark gray, and one with a black. I originally wanted to do 4 layers, but I thought 3 was good. I went a little bit darker with the values than I wanted to. So, okay, the first thing that I'm going to do is cut out all my whites. And you can see on this plate, I've only got a little bit of white that I'm going to cut out. Some of these like little smoky things like that are going on here, and then some of the lines in the sky. So I'm going to print this in my first color, and I still have to go in and do some cutting in here because I want this to be kind of green. So my first color I want to be yellow. So I'm probably just going to ink this whole thing up in yellow and print it, and then I'll have white lines where I've already cut. Now, once I do that, I'm going to go back in and cut out everything that I want to keep yellow. So I'm going to cut out the little bits that are left in here. I'm going to cut out this kind of shape right here. I'm probably going to leave those, but I might cut out some of the grass. I'm not really sure. I haven't really figured it out yet, and then I would print it in my next darkest color. So I go from yellow to say green, or just depending on how many layers you intend to do, you want to think about the way that the colors are going to interact. Typically though, you want to go from your lighter value colors, your yellows, oranges, greens, to your darker valued colors, your reds and your blues. And then you want to end with black. So the black is going to be the key and that's going to pull everything together. So you can see here, I cut out all my whites, and this is a bad impression of this, so it's not quite as clear. Cut out all my whites and print it in this gray, this light gray that you can kind of see here. And then once I've printed it, so this was, imagine this was all that light gray, and then I cut out, you can see all these little cut marks. That's what I cut out next. And then I printed it in the next darkest gray, so that's this color. And then once I printed it in that color, I cut out everything that I wanted to stay that color. So ultimately, that's why you don't see anything here, because this has already been cut out, you know, over those two impressions. Same with this. See, it's totally gone. Most of the wings have nothing in them. You know, all the highlights up here are now gone, but I left my shadows down here, you know, any information like to just kind of pull the image together. And you can see the background is really black, but I've got lots of that gone now. So that's essentially why you're printing like this, a reductive cut. And that idea of the suicide is like it's cutting away different layers as it goes, and you can't kind of go back. So once you've made those cuts, you can't like add to it. Now I could introduce other layers with this as well. I could have done more interacting with layers. Now the reason that I chose reductive is because I wanted to get it all in one block. I didn't want to have a bunch of different blocks and cut everything all at once. I was able to just do a registration method where I could line up my paper to this every single time, and it wasn't a big deal. And I'll show you a simple kind of registration that worked well for me. I think this is what I was using, but we'll see. This might not be it though. Anyway, you find something that's the same height as the one that you're working on. This one is not, so this is probably not the one. But then you make these little registration things. These are like for what you would call butt registration, and it's also kind of like a T-bar registration also. So all my paper has 2 marks on it. This is not the one that I was using, but you can imagine every time, so I would line up, make a mark for my corners, make sure that that's perfect. And this is not the same, but you know, I would line up my corner, and then I have a mark here, and that mark corresponds with a mark on my paper. So I can line up my paper every single time, and it goes to the same spot. And I would have 2 marks, so there are 2 on this paper, as you can see, but it's slightly different. So you trim all your paper, put those marks on the back, those T-bar registration marks, line it up with your jig, and then every time you run it through the press, it kind of helps to, you know, make sure that everything is lined up. And it's pretty foolproof. As long as you trim your paper well, you won't have any problems with it, as long as you're consistent from the beginning. So that's kind of why I made these jigs, is just to kind of minimize problems with registration. Okay, so that's a reductive cut. Now, the layers with a reductive cut, they go on top of each other, and so there's no interaction, so layers don't overlap at all. And, you know, maybe I want to have layers overlap, and maybe I want to add some transparency to some of the colors so you can see the under layers. Now, that's not so much the case with this. I don't really care about transparency, but I just wanted to do something for demonstration purposes that could kind of demonstrate what I'm doing. So again, I started with a drawing, and that drawing was on transparency paper, or tracing paper. That helps a lot, right? Having tracing paper. And then I just basically took the paper, taped it to my block, and then I can take some of this carbon tracing paper and just, so it would have been, so imagine this is a drawing. I can even use a jig for this. So take my drawing, line it up, slide my tracing or my carbon paper underneath, and then trace over it with a ballpoint pencil, and that will come through and leave the drawing on this plate. And I can do that if I have like a key drawing or a master drawing. I can, with all the information on it, I can use that same drawing over and over and over, and take this one out, pop in another one, trace the elements that I want to go on this plate. You know, each plate is going to be a different color. Another thing to keep in mind too is, like, if you have elements that are separate, then you might be able to ink these up in separate colors at the same time. So these are far enough apart where I could probably ink these up in yellow and this in blue and get two colors out of one plate. That's not really what I'm gonna do though. Let's see. Other ways to transfer your image. If you have your drawing on one side, you probably want to do it on thinner paper. This is kind of thick, so I wouldn't be able to get an impression from this. So on thinner paper, and then take like a 6B pencil and just graphite the back like this, and then turn around and then trace your image, and that graphite will transfer onto your linoleum. So that's a way of just making your own transfer paper. Not a big deal. It's pretty easy. If you have the tracing paper, you know, that helps too. But once you have that on your block, typically you want to go in with Sharpie because it's easier to see. You know, the black of the Sharpie contrasts with the gray of the linoleum much better than the graphite does. Gives you a much better sense of where you've already cut. It also gives you more of a sense of the type of mark making that's possible with linoleum, because your cuts are going to be a little bit thicker mark making than, say, intaglio. That's not to say you can't get really fine details with it. Once you've done that, some people prefer to take a red marker like this and just go over the, so once they do the drawing in black Sharpie, they'll take a red Sharpie and go over the entire thing, and it'll turn all of the gray areas red. And then as you are cutting, it's turning gray, so you can see much more clearly. If there's red remaining, then those are areas that you need to cut. Whereas, like, you know, it gets to be kind of hard to see some of the, like, maybe I missed a few of these lines when I was cutting, because it's harder to see the gray because it's gray after you've cut it as well. So that might be helpful for some people. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you're doing a reductive cut though. If you're just doing a black lino cut, go for it. But if you're doing a reductive color print, probably you want to stay away from this because the red will bleed through into some of your colors. I mean, it possibly could. I've seen Sharpie come off too. The type of paper that we're using, I'm just using a Stonehenge paper for this, but you might want to use like a traditional Kozo paper, mulberry paper, Thai Kozo paper is really nice. Japanese papers are really beautiful. So the Eastern papers work really well, but Western papers you can use as well and get some good results. Another thing to keep in mind is if you're using like a Western paper that's thicker, you're etching on or using an etching press to print, you know, if I print this like that with no blanket, then I'm not really going to get any texture. But if I print it with a blanket, then my prints will be embossed, and so you know it'll really push in. But again, you might not want to do that if you're doing multiple layers of registration, because the type of might be harder to register if it's been embossed like that. Okay, so that's basically it. Reductive woodcut, reductive lino cut, suicide cut versus using multi-blocks. And you know, this will give you much more dynamic kind of interaction between the layers with multiple blocks, but sometimes it's more economical to just do this, and registration might be a little bit easier with this as well. Yeah, so also you'd be printing in different sections. So I would print 20, like say my edition's 20, I would print my 20 impressions in my first color, and then I would wait overnight. I'd bring this home, cut away all the stuff for the next day, come back tomorrow and print the next layer. So you kind of have to do them all in a step. Whereas if I do this, I have 4 plates that are ready to go. I can literally ink up all 4 of these prints and you know, run them through one after another. The ink isn't gonna have a lot of time to dry, but that's okay. Another thing with transferring an image, if I have a key plate, all of my information is, all my black information is going to be on one plate, and that's how I want to do it. I can do that with this type of plate. I could cut everything, I'm done, this has all my black information, but I want to transfer this to my other blocks without having to go through a bunch of processes of trying to use transfer paper and copying it. A really easy way to do that, just take a nice sheet of paper, ink up your block in black, put it in the jig, take your paper and tape it right along the edge. Once I've taped that, you can see it kind of flips up. So run it through the press and bring it over here. This is inked up. I want to transfer it to my other block. I'm going to run it through the press, and once it gets to the other side, I'm going to lift the paper, leave it attached by the tape, take out this block, and then I can replace it with a fresh block that has nothing on it. I could pop that in the jig, lower the paper because the ink would be wet still, lower that, run it through the press again, preferably in the same direction, right? So I don't want it to go through this way, I want it to go through the same way, and then that wet ink will transfer onto this block. And then I have a registration for this block to the other one, and it's really pretty foolproof. And then I can cut away whatever I wanted to for my color plate, and I could probably get another one out of that as well. If I wanted to pop in another block, I'd probably still be able to get some information enough to make it workable. Okay, so that's another really helpful way to transfer an image from your key block. You know, you have your finished drawing, you're done cutting your key block, and you want to get it onto your color blocks to cut those next. It's a great way to do it. It's really easy. Okay, we'll be back and print.